I paid for my son's entire wedding. Every flower. Every chair. Every promise of a perfect day. Then, the night before the ceremony, my daughter-in-law stood in front of everyone and said 5 words that changed everything. You're not welcome here. Leave. What happened next destroyed the wedding. I once came across a family story that disturbed me in a way I didn't expect. Not because it involved violence. Not because it was scandalous in the way people usually mean. But because it revealed something quieter. And in some ways more unsettling. A mother paid for her son's entire wedding. Every flower. Every chair. Every plate of food. Every note of music that would play when the bride walked down the aisle. Nearly $50,000 in total. And the night before the wedding at the rehearsal dinner, the bride looked at her in front of everyone and said something that stopped the entire room cold. You're not welcome here. Leave. Imagine that moment for a second. The soft lighting. The clinking glasses. Guests laughing politely the way people do at events that are meant to feel joyful. Then suddenly a voice cuts through the room. Sharp. Unmistakable. You've done enough damage. Leave. And standing there in the center of that silence was the woman who had paid for everything. Her name was Colleen Meyer. What fascinates me about stories like this isn't just the cruelty of the moment. Families argue. People say things they regret. Weddings are stressful and emotions run high. But the detail that stayed with me, the one that made me keep thinking about this story long after I first heard it, was something else entirely. Colleen's son was standing right there. Ryan. The child she had raised. The person she had spent decades protecting, supporting, and sacrificing for. The same son whose wedding she had just funded almost entirely. And when his fiancé told his mother to leave the venue she had paid for, Ryan didn't say a word. He didn't defend her. He didn't argue. According to several people who witnessed it, he didn't even look at her. He just stared at the floor. Now pause for a moment and think about that. Because family stories like this aren't really about weddings. They aren't about money either. Not at their core. They're about loyalty. They're about respect. And sometimes they're about the painful moment. When someone realizes that the role they thought they played in their family isn't the role everyone else sees. I've spent years listening to stories like this. Stories about parents and children, about marriages, about the invisible expectations that quietly shape family relationships. Some of them are beautiful. Some of them are heartbreaking. But every once in a while, one of these stories reveals something deeper about human nature. Something uncomfortable that many of us recognize if we're honest with ourselves. This is one of those stories. Welcome to the channel Empathetic Story. If you enjoy thoughtful family stories that explore the complicated emotions behind real human relationships, take a moment to subscribe. Supporting the channel helps us keep sharing stories that make people think, reflect, and sometimes see their own lives a little more clearly. Because the story of Colleen Meyer doesn't begin with revenge. It begins with humiliation. That night at the rehearsal dinner, something inside her broke in a very quiet way. There was no shouting.
No dramatic confrontation.
No attempt to defend herself in front of the 50 guests who had suddenly gone silent. Colleen simply stood there holding her purse. Inside that purse was the check that had paid for the entire celebration. The venue they were standing in. The dinner everyone was eating. The flowers arranged on every table. Everything. Then she turned around and walked out. Past the guests who pretended not to stare. Past the decorations she had helped choose months earlier. Past the future daughter-in-law who had just told her to leave. Out into the dark parking lot. When I picture that moment, I always imagine the silence of sitting alone in a car after something like that happens. The kind of silence where your mind replays the same sentence over and over again. You're not welcome here. But here's the question that kept pulling me deeper into this story. What happens when the person being humiliated realizes something the rest of the room hasn't thought about yet? What happens when that quiet woman sitting alone in the parking lot suddenly understands a very simple truth? The wedding everyone inside that venue was celebrating didn't actually belong to the bride and groom. It belonged to the person who had paid for it. And if that person was no longer welcome there, then maybe the wedding itself shouldn't exist at all. What Colleen did next would unravel the entire event in less than 24 hours. But before we get there, we have to understand exactly what happened inside that rehearsal dinner. and why the silence of one son may have been the most important moment in the entire story. To understand why Colleen's quiet walk out of that rehearsal dinner would later unravel an entire wedding, we have to step back into that room and look more carefully at what really happened that night. Rehearsal dinners are supposed to feel relaxed. If you've ever been to one, you know the atmosphere. It's the soft landing before the chaos of the wedding day. A smaller group of people, usually family and close friends, gathering to celebrate what everyone believes will be the beginning of a new chapter. People tell stories about the couple. Parents give short speeches. There's laughter, a little awkwardness, and the quiet excitement that comes before something important. That evening had started exactly that way. The restaurant was warm and softly lit. Long tables had been arranged carefully, with centerpieces Colleen herself had approved weeks earlier. The catering staff moved smoothly through the room with trays of drinks and small plates. Guests leaned close to one another, catching up, exchanging travel stories, complimenting Emma's dress. On the surface, everything looked like a celebration. But if you listen closely to the way people later described that evening, there was something else in the air too. Something subtle. A kind of tension that didn't have a clear source yet, but was slowly building beneath the polite conversations. Emma Whittaker, the bride-to-be, had been moving quickly between tables, greeting relatives and friends. Several guests later said she seemed unusually sharp that night. Not outwardly rude, not openly angry, but restless. Irritated in a way that made people around her slightly uncomfortable. Now when I think about family conflicts, I've noticed something interesting. They almost never begin with one dramatic moment out of nowhere. They build quietly over time. Small misunderstandings, unspoken expectations, little comments that linger longer than they should. And then one night, one sentence releases everything that has been sitting beneath the surface. At some point during the dinner, Emma walked directly toward Colleen. No one remembers exactly what triggered the moment. Some guests believe Emma had been arguing earlier about seating arrangements. Others thought it might have been tension from the long months of wedding planning. But what everyone remembers clearly is what Emma said. "You're not welcome here." The words cut through the room in a way that instantly changed the atmosphere. Several nearby conversations stopped. People turned in their chairs. A few guests thought they had misheard at first. But Emma continued, pointing toward the exit. "You've done enough damage. Leave." There's something about public humiliation that freezes a room. It creates a strange pause where people suddenly become aware that they are witnessing something deeply uncomfortable. And in the center of that silence stood Colleen. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't arguing. She was holding her purse. What strikes me about that detail is how ordinary it is. A woman standing in a room, holding her purse, surrounded by people who suddenly don't know where to look. Inside that purse was something no one else in the room seemed to be thinking about. The check that had paid for nearly everything around them. Now, when moments like this happen in families, attention naturally shifts to someone else. Ryan, Emma's fiancé.
Colleen's son.
If you've ever watched a conflict like this unfold, you know what people instinctively expect next. The person caught in the middle usually steps forward, says something calming, tries to smooth things over. That's what people were waiting for. But Ryan didn't move. He stood there, his shoulders tense, his eyes fixed somewhere below the table level. One guest later described it in a way that stayed with me. She said it looked like Ryan was trying to disappear inside the moment, as if staying silent might somehow make the entire situation vanish. But silence has its own meaning. When Emma told Colleen to leave, Ryan could have said 100 different things. He could have asked Emma to stop. He could have reminded everyone that Colleen was his mother. He could have simply said, "Let's calm down." Instead, he said nothing. And that silence traveled through the room like a quiet signal. The signal that no one was going to challenge what had just happened. For Colleen, that may have been the most painful part. Not Emma's words, but the realization that her son had chosen not to defend her. You can imagine the emotional weight of that moment. Years of parenting, years of sacrifices, suddenly compressed into a single realization that the person you raised is now standing still while someone else humiliates you. But here's the part of the story that reveals something about Colleen's character. She didn't explode. She didn't try to explain herself. She didn't demand respect from the room. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the purse in her hand, turned toward the exit, and began walking. Guests moved slightly to let her pass. Some stared at their plates. Others pretended to be focused on their drinks. No one stopped her. And in that quiet walk across the room, past decorations she had helped select and tables she had helped arrange, something inside Colleen changed. Because humiliation sometimes has a strange side effect. It forces clarity. By the time she stepped outside into the night air, she was no longer thinking about the argument itself. She was thinking about something else entirely. About ownership. About control. About the simple fact that every piece of that celebration had been built with her money. And sitting alone in the dark parking lot a few minutes later, a realization began to take shape that would soon turn the entire wedding upside down. If she wasn't welcome inside that room, then maybe none of it should exist at all. And that realization, quiet, unsettling, impossible to ignore, followed Colleen all the way home that night. There's something about the silence after a public humiliation that changes the way a person thinks. The noise of the room disappears. The embarrassment fades into the background. What remains is a strange clarity, as if the mind begins sorting through everything that has led up to that moment. Colleen didn't go straight to bed when she got home. Instead, she walked into her kitchen, set her purse on the table, and stood there for a long time without moving. I've heard people describe moments like this before. Not explosive moments, not dramatic turning points filled with shouting or confrontation. The real turning points are often quiet. They look almost ordinary from the outside. But inside someone's mind, something irreversible has just happened. For Colleen, that moment came when she opened the large binder she had spent months creating. It sat on the kitchen table exactly where she had left it earlier that week, thick with neatly labeled tabs. Venue, catering, florist, photographer, entertainment, transportation. Every detail of the wedding had been carefully organized inside those pages. And every single contract had one name printed at the bottom. Colleen Meyer. Now this is the part of the story where something shifts, not just emotionally but structurally. Because up until this point, everyone had been behaving as if the wedding belonged to Ryan and Emma. That's how weddings are usually framed. The bride and groom make the decisions, the families support them, and the celebration revolves around the couple's future. But sitting at that kitchen table, flipping through the contracts one by one, Colleen realized something that no one else in that rehearsal dinner seemed to have considered. Legally speaking, the wedding wasn't Ryan and Emma's event. It was hers. She had signed the agreements. She had paid the deposits. She had taken responsibility for every vendor scheduled to show up the next day. In other words, the entire event existed because she had created it. Now here's something I find fascinating about family dynamics. When generosity lasts long enough, people begin to forget it was generosity in the first place. It slowly becomes part of the background, something expected, something assumed. Ryan and Emma had spent the past year planning their dream wedding. They had chosen colors, themes, music, flowers. They had talked endlessly about how beautiful the ceremony would be. But Colleen had been the one making sure the dream was actually possible. And suddenly, after what had happened at the rehearsal dinner, that arrangement no longer made sense. She wasn't welcome there. Then why was she still paying for it? That thought didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with a strange calm. Colleen reached for her phone. The first call she made was to the wedding planner. The woman answered cheerfully, still operating under the assumption that everything was moving forward as planned. "Hi, Colleen," she said. "I was just reviewing tomorrow's timeline." For a moment, Colleen listened to the familiar professional tone on the other end of the line. Then she spoke. "I'm canceling everything." The silence that followed was long enough to feel almost physical. "I'm sorry," the planner said carefully. "Did you say cancel?" "Yes." Another pause. "Well, the contracts are under your name," the planner admitted. "But the event is tomorrow. This is very last minute." Colleen looked down at the open binder in front of her. "If I'm not welcome at the wedding," she said quietly, "then neither is my money." The planner didn't argue. Legally, there was nothing to argue about. The contracts were clear. Once that first call ended, Colleen began making the rest. The venue manager, the caterer, the florist, the photographer, the band. Each conversation followed the same pattern. At first there was confusion. Then there was cautious confirmation. And finally, the quiet acceptance that the event scheduled for the following day no longer existed. As the calls continued, something unexpected began happening inside Colleen. The humiliation she had felt earlier that evening began fading. Not because the memory disappeared, but because the balance of power had quietly shifted. For years she had been the person trying to keep peace in the family, the one who wrote checks, solved problems, and avoided conflict whenever possible. But now she was doing something different. She was drawing a boundary, and boundaries often surprise the people who never expected them. By the time the last phone call ended, the wedding that Ryan and Emma had spent months planning had already begun to unravel. The flowers would not arrive. The music would not play. The venue would not open its doors for them. All because the person who had made the entire celebration possible had finally stepped away. But what Colleen didn't know yet, what no one knew yet, was that the story was about to become even more complicated. Because the next morning would reveal something that made the wedding drama look small in comparison. Something hidden in her own financial records. Something that suggested this situation had never really been about a wedding at all. What Colleen didn't realize yet was that the moment she canceled those contracts, the illusion surrounding the wedding had already begun to crack. And the first people to feel it were Ryan and Emma. The morning after she made those calls, the consequences started moving quietly through the network of vendors that had been preparing for the wedding. The venue manager marked the date as canceled. The caterer removed the event from their weekend schedule. The florist stopped preparing the arrangements that had taken weeks to plan. Each vendor had one thing in common. They all had Colleen's name on their contracts. And when the person whose name sits at the bottom of a contract calls to cancel, the system simply moves forward. There's no drama in those phone calls. No moral judgment. Just business. But for Ryan and Emma, the realization came as a shock. Ryan showed up at Colleen's house later that morning. When I imagine that moment, I always picture the way anger tends to arrive before reflection. It's human nature. When something unexpected collapses in our lives, we often look for someone to blame before we look for understanding. Ryan knocked hard on the front door. Not the polite knock of a visitor. The kind of pounding that carries frustration behind it. "Mom, open the door," he shouted through the wood. "We need to talk." Inside the house, Colleen stood in the hallway for a moment before walking over. Not rushing. Not panicking. Just moving with the quiet steadiness of someone who had already made her decision. When she opened the door, Ryan pushed past her into the living room. His hair was messy, his voice sharp. "The venue says the event is canceled," he said immediately. "The caterer won't return our calls. The band says they've been released from the contract." He turned toward her, disbelief written across his face. "What did you do?" It's interesting how often people frame a situation that way. Not what happened. Not how did this happen. What did you do? As if the responsibility must belong to someone else. Colleen looked at him calmly. "I stopped paying for it," she said. For a moment Ryan seemed genuinely stunned. "You can't just cancel our wedding," he said. That sentence carries something revealing in it. Our wedding. The assumption that the event belonged entirely to him and Emma. But Colleen's response was quiet and precise. "I didn't cancel your wedding," she replied. "I canceled the contracts that were in my name." Ryan ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Emma was upset last night," he said. "You know how stressful weddings are. I've noticed that phrase appears in many family conflicts. Someone behaves badly, and the explanation arrives quickly. They were stressed. They didn't mean it. You're overreacting." Ryan continued pacing the room. "You've destroyed everything," he said. "Do you know how many people are expecting to come tomorrow? Emma's crying right now." Colleen listened without interrupting. Then she asked a simple question. "If Emma wants the wedding," she said quietly, "why didn't she want me there?" Ryan stopped pacing. That question hung in the air for a moment, because it forced him to confront the part of the story he had been trying to avoid. The rehearsal dinner. The words Emma had said. The silence that followed. Ryan's voice hardened. "You're making this bigger than it was," he said. And that's another pattern I see often when people are confronted with uncomfortable truths. They minimize. They reduce the moment. They treat humiliation as a misunderstanding. But some things don't shrink just because someone asks them to. You stood there, Colleen said calmly, while she told me to leave. Ryan looked away. For a second, the confidence in his voice faded. I didn't want to make a scene, he muttered. That sentence says more than he probably intended. Because in trying not to create a scene, he had allowed one to happen anyway. Just in a different direction. The scene had been his mother walking out of a room full of people who said nothing. Ryan's frustration quickly returned. You've always been controlling, he said sharply. You think everything has to revolve around you. There it was. The accusation that often appears when someone refuses to keep sacrificing. Controlling. Selfish. Difficult. Words people use when the person who has always given finally decides to stop. Colleen stood quietly for a moment. Then she walked to the front door and opened it. You should go, she said. Ryan stared at her as if waiting for her to change her mind. But she didn't. After a long moment he stepped outside and slammed the door behind him. And as the house fell silent again, Colleen understood something that Ryan and Emma still hadn't realized. They believed she had destroyed their wedding. But in reality, the wedding had been built entirely on a foundation they had never truly acknowledged. Her willingness to keep giving. And the moment that willingness disappeared, the celebration they had been planning began to collapse. But the story still wasn't finished revealing its truth. Because very soon Colleen would discover something hidden in her financial records that would change the entire meaning of what Ryan and Emma had been doing all along. And it was during the quiet hours after Ryan left that the story took a turn no one had expected. Up until that point, Colleen believed she had simply stepped away from a wedding she was no longer welcome to attend. Painful, yes. Embarrassing, certainly. But still something that could be explained as a family conflict. That spiraled out of control. What she discovered next changed the entire meaning of what had been happening. Later that afternoon, Colleen sat down at her kitchen table with her laptop. The house was unusually quiet. For the first time in months there were no vendor calls, no wedding planning notes, no last-minute adjustments to seating charts or delivery schedules. Just silence. I think moments like that are when people finally begin to look closely at things they had been too busy to notice before. Colleen opened her email inbox to organize the remaining wedding documents. Even though the event had been canceled, she still wanted to keep records of the contracts and communications. It was a habit she had developed after years of managing finances carefully. That's when one message caught her attention. The subject line read, Final payment confirmation, Maldives honeymoon package. At first, Colleen assumed it had been sent by mistake. Vendors often send promotional emails around wedding season. She almost deleted it without opening it. But something about the wording made her pause. She clicked the message. And as she read through the confirmation, the room seemed to grow very still. The email detailed a luxury honeymoon reservation. 14 nights in a private overwater villa in the Maldives. A personal butler. A private yacht excursion. Champagne service included. At the bottom of the message was a cheerful note congratulating Ryan Meyer and Emma Whitaker on their upcoming marriage. Total cost, $26,000. But the detail that made Colleen's stomach drop wasn't the destination. It was the billing information. The entire package had been charged to her credit card. Now when I hear stories like this, I always pause for a moment at this point. Because there's a difference between accepting help from someone and quietly using their money without permission. The email confirmed that the reservation had been made 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks. Colleen leaned back in her chair, trying to remember what had been happening around that time. Then it came back to her. 3 weeks earlier she had met Emma for lunch. They had been discussing flower arrangements for the ceremony. Emma had seemed cheerful that day, flipping through photos of floral designs on her phone, asking Colleen which colors would look best in the venue. And while that conversation was happening, this honeymoon had already been booked. With Colleen's credit card. She scrolled further through the email. The reservation included additional services, spa treatments, transportation upgrades, special dining experiences. Everything carefully arranged, but never once mentioned to her. Colleen opened her banking app. At first she told herself it must be an isolated mistake. Maybe the travel agency had accidentally saved her card information from a previous transaction. But as the list of recent purchases appeared on the screen, that explanation became harder to believe. There were other charges. a boutique purchase connected to Emma's bridal wardrobe, designer luggage for the honeymoon, a private chef deposit for a rehearsal event, thousands of dollars in transactions she had never authorized, one after another, each one tied in some way to the wedding or the honeymoon that was supposed to follow it. And suddenly the entire story began to look different. What Colleen had originally interpreted as entitlement now seemed more deliberate. Ryan and Emma hadn't simply expected her to pay for the wedding. They had quietly built an entire lifestyle around the assumption that she would continue paying. That realization is the moment in this story that stayed with me the longest. Because financial exploitation inside families rarely begins with obvious wrongdoing. It usually starts with small assumptions. They won't mind. They can afford it. They were going to help anyway. Those assumptions slowly erase the boundary between generosity and permission. And once that boundary disappears, people begin making decisions with someone else's money as if it belongs to them. Colleen closed her laptop slowly. For several minutes she sat there in silence, staring at the table. The humiliation from the rehearsal dinner now felt almost secondary compared to what she had just uncovered. Because the situation wasn't simply about disrespect anymore. It was about trust. About the quiet expectation that she would always keep giving, no matter how she was treated. But the discovery of those charges also made something else clear. This situation had moved beyond family arguments and emotional hurt. There were financial records now. Evidence. Paper trails. And that meant the next step could no longer be handled with conversations or apologies. It required someone who understood exactly how to protect her legally. Someone who had been quietly advising her for years. Her attorney Margaret Chen. The discovery of those charges changed something fundamental for Colleen, and it was that shift that led her to make the next call. The following morning, she sat across from Margaret Chen in a quiet office filled with morning light. If you've ever met someone who works in law for a long time, you start to recognize a certain kind of composure. Margaret had that calm, focused presence that comes from years of listening to complicated situations and separating emotion from fact. Margaret had represented Colleen for several years, mostly for routine matters, financial paperwork, estate planning, the kind of legal details people hope they won't have to think about very often. But that morning, Colleen wasn't there for routine advice. She told Margaret everything. The rehearsal dinner. The words Emma had used. Ryan standing there without saying anything. The decision to cancel the wedding vendors. The discovery of the honeymoon charges and the other purchases connected to her credit card. Margaret didn't interrupt. She simply listened, occasionally making a note on the yellow legal pad in front of her. When Colleen finished, the room fell quiet for a moment. Then Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair and folded her hands. First, she said calmly, you need to understand something very clearly. Canceling the wedding contracts was completely within your legal rights. That sentence alone carried more relief than Colleen had expected. In family conflicts, people often feel guilty for asserting boundaries, especially when money is involved. Parents, in particular, are used to being told they should sacrifice for their children without question. But Margaret's explanation cut through that emotional confusion. Every vendor agreement had been signed by Colleen. Every deposit had been paid from her account. Every contract listed her as the responsible party. That meant the event existed under her authority. If they try to argue about the cancellation, Margaret continued, they won't have much ground to stand on. The vendors recognized you as the client. Colleen nodded slowly. The conversation could have ended there. But Margaret tapped the folder of financial records Colleen had brought with her. Now let's talk about the credit card charges. She reviewed the emails and statements carefully, scanning each page with the methodical attention of someone who had seen many complicated financial situations before. This honeymoon reservation, Margaret said, pointing to the confirmation email. Did you approve this purchase? No. And the boutique charges? No. Margaret nodded once, making another note. Then she opened a separate document and slid it across the desk. This is something else you should see. The paper showed a series of transactions connected to a bank account Colleen recognized immediately. It was the account she had opened years earlier for Ryan when he went to college. At the time it had seemed like a simple gesture of support. A small financial safety net, so he could handle emergencies or unexpected expenses while he was studying. Colleen had assumed Ryan stopped using it long ago. But the statements told a different story. Withdrawals had continued. Not small amounts either. Several $1,000s at a time. One withdrawal stood out in particular. $7,500 taken just weeks before the rehearsal dinner. Right around the same time Colleen had paid the deposit for the wedding venue. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Ryan and Emma hadn't simply relied on her help. They had been quietly drawing from multiple sources connected to her finances. Margaret closed the folder. "We should freeze this account immediately," she said. For a moment Colleen hesitated. That account had once symbolized something very simple: trust. It had been her way of telling her son that she believed in him and would always help him if he needed it. But the meaning of that account had clearly changed. Now it represented access without responsibility. "Freeze it," Colleen said quietly. Margaret nodded and reached for the phone, giving a brief set of instructions to her legal assistant. Within minutes the process had begun. Account access would be suspended. Written confirmations of the wedding cancellation would be sent to each vendor. And Margaret began drafting another document. A cease and desist letter. Emma's online posts accusing Colleen of sabotaging the wedding had already begun circulating through social media. Margaret intended to stop that narrative before it spread further. "This situation isn't just emotional anymore," Margaret said. "There are financial records involved now. If the accusations continue publicly, we'll respond formally." Listening to Margaret speak, Colleen felt something unfamiliar settling over her. Not anger. Not sadness. Something steadier. For years she had been the one trying to keep peace in the family, absorbing frustration and smoothing over conflicts so everyone else could move forward comfortably. But sitting there in that quiet office, watching her attorney methodically secure her legal position, Colleen realized she didn't have to carry that role anymore. Ryan and Emma would have to deal with the consequences of their choices themselves. And outside that office, the consequences were already beginning to spread in ways none of them had anticipated. Because while the legal process moved quietly in the background, another force had started shaping the story: public attention. And once the internet began asking questions, the version of events Ryan and Emma had hoped to control would start to unravel very quickly. And while the legal side of the situation was quietly moving forward, something else was beginning to unfold in a much louder place: the internet. In the past, conflicts like this might have remained inside families. A few phone calls, some tense gatherings, whispered explanations between relatives. But today, stories rarely stay contained within living rooms. They spill outward, carried by social media posts and late-night messages, and the strange gravity of public attention. Emma was the one who took the first step. A few days after the rehearsal dinner, Colleen's phone began buzzing with notifications from people she hadn't heard from in years. Old neighbors, distant cousins, former coworkers. At first she didn't understand why. Then she opened Facebook. Emma had posted a video. In the video she looked visibly emotional. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying. Ryan sat beside her, one arm wrapped around her shoulders in a gesture that was meant to appear protective. Above the video was a caption: "I never thought my future mother-in-law would destroy our wedding out of jealousy and spite." The video itself told a very specific story. Emma spoke slowly, occasionally pausing as if trying to hold back tears. She explained that the wedding had suddenly been cancelled, that vendors had been called and pressured to back out, that the happiest moment of their lives had been taken away from them without warning. She didn't mention the rehearsal dinner. She didn't mention the words she had spoken that night. And she certainly didn't mention the honeymoon charges. But on social media, the first version of a story often spreads faster than the truth. Within minutes, the comments began to appear. "So sorry you're going through this. What kind of mother would do that to her own son? Stay strong." Hundreds of people watched the video, many of them strangers who knew nothing about the situation but felt confident enough to offer opinions. Now this is the part of the story that fascinates me most, because social media has a strange rhythm to it. At first, people react emotionally. They respond to the story that's presented in front of them. But if the situation is complicated enough, questions begin to surface. And questions have a way of changing everything. One comment appeared beneath Emma's video: "Didn't Colleen pay for the wedding?" It was a simple question, But questions invite answers. Another person replied, "My cousin works at the venue. The contract was in Colleen's name." Then another comment appeared. "I heard the honeymoon was charged to her card." Within hours, the tone of the conversation began shifting. People started digging deeper. Screenshots of vendor emails appeared in wedding planning groups online. Someone posted a message from the florist confirming that Colleen had been listed as the official client for the event. Another user shared details about the honeymoon booking. Maldives. 14 nights. Luxury villa. Charged to Colleen's credit card. The same internet that had rushed to defend Emma was now asking different questions. If she paid for everything, why would you kick her out? Who tells the person funding the wedding to leave? Sounds like someone bit the hand that feeds them. Online discussions can become ruthless very quickly. What had started as sympathy began turning into skepticism. People who had initially believed Emma's version of events started realizing there were pieces missing from the story. And once the missing pieces appear, narratives start collapsing. Even some people who knew Ryan personally began weighing in. One former college friend commented, "Ryan always expected his mom to handle things. Not surprised this happened." Emma's Instagram account, which had been filled with engagement photos and countdown posts only weeks earlier, suddenly went quiet. But the comments under those photos kept growing. Not supportive anymore. Curious. Critical. Sometimes sarcastic. What's interesting is that Colleen never responded publicly. She didn't post her own explanation. She didn't argue in the comments sections. Instead, she quietly saved screenshots of the posts and forwarded them to Margaret. Evidence. Because while people online were debating the story, the legal and personal consequences were beginning to unfold in the real world. Friends who had once been excited about the wedding stopped calling Ryan and Emma. Relatives began asking uncomfortable questions. And the wedding that had once been the center of everyone's attention was now something else entirely. Cautionary story. Not about a canceled event, but about what happens when someone mistakes generosity for weakness. And in the weeks that followed, as the noise of social media slowly faded, Colleen found herself reflecting on something deeper than the conflict itself. Because the real meaning of the story was never about the internet's reaction. It was about the moment a person finally understands that love without boundaries can turn into something dangerous. And sometimes the bravest thing someone can do for themselves is simply stop paying for their own disrespect. And after all the noise faded, the arguments, the online speculation, the legal letters, what remained was something much quieter. The question of what this story actually meant. Because when I think about Colleen Meyer's story now, I don't think about the canceled wedding first. I think about the moment when a person finally realizes the role they have been playing in their own family. For years, Colleen had been the reliable one. The person who solved problems before they became emergencies. The one who stepped in financially when things were difficult. The one who tried to smooth over disagreements so everyone else could stay comfortable. Most families have someone like that. The one who keeps things functioning. And when that role continues long enough, something subtle begins to happen. The sacrifices become invisible. The help becomes routine. The person providing it slowly stops being seen as someone making a choice. Instead, they become part of the system. Expected. Assumed. And that's why the story of this wedding stayed with me long after I first heard it. Because the real turning point wasn't the canceled venue or the internet controversy. It was the moment Colleen realized something simple and painful at the same time. The people around her had stopped seeing her generosity as a gift. They had started seeing it as an obligation. That shift is one of the most dangerous dynamics inside families. When help becomes expected, gratitude disappears quietly. No one announces that change out loud. It just slowly replaces appreciation with entitlement. Ryan and Emma may never have consciously said to themselves, "We're using her." But their actions suggested they had already built their future around the assumption that Colleen would always continue giving. The wedding, the honeymoon, the expenses surrounding both. All of it depended on that assumption. And when Colleen stepped away from that role, the entire structure collapsed almost immediately. What's interesting is that from Ryan and Emma's perspective, the situation probably looked very different. To them, it may have felt like the wedding had been taken away. Like something important had been unfairly destroyed. But from Colleen's perspective, something else had happened. She had simply stopped participating in her own disrespect. There's a powerful difference between those two interpretations. One sees the loss of something expected. The other sees the recovery of something important. Self-respect. I often think about how difficult it must have been for Colleen to make that decision. Walking away from a conflict inside a family is rarely simple. Love complicates everything. Memories complicate everything. And yet, sometimes the most compassionate thing a person can do for themselves is set a boundary that should have existed long before. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're clarity. They show people where generosity ends and responsibility begins. Without them, relationships slowly drift into unhealthy patterns where one person gives and another simply takes. In the weeks after the wedding collapsed, Colleen eventually stepped back from the situation entirely. She stopped responding to the messages. She allowed her attorney to handle the legal details. She focused on rebuilding a quieter life that no longer revolved around solving problems for everyone else. And strangely enough, that distance brought something unexpected. Peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from fixing everything, but the kind that comes from finally understanding that not every relationship can be repaired by sacrificing more of yourself. When I reflect on this story now, the image that stays with me isn't the rehearsal dinner, or the angry phone calls, or the online arguments. Something much simpler. A woman sitting quietly at her kitchen table, closing a laptop after discovering the truth about the people she trusted, and deciding that she would no longer pay the price for someone else's expectations. Family stories often leave us with uncomfortable questions. How much should parents give? Where is the line between love and enabling? And what happens when someone finally decides that the line has been crossed? Colleen Meyer didn't destroy a wedding. She simply stopped funding it. And in doing that, she forced everyone involved, including herself, to face a truth that had been hiding behind years of generosity. Respect cannot be purchased. Not with money. Not with sacrifice. And not even with love. If you've listened this far, I'd genuinely like to know what you think about this story. Was Colleen right to walk away when she did? Or do you believe family obligations should have outweighed everything that happened? Stories like this don't always have simple answers, but sometimes they reveal something important about the boundaries we all have to decide for ourselves. When I step back and look at Colleen Meyer's story as a whole, what stands out isn't the canceled wedding, the online drama, or even the legal conflict. Those events are dramatic, yes, but they're only the surface of something much deeper. At its core, this story is about the quiet moment when a person realizes that kindness has slowly been mistaken for obligation. For years, Colleen gave without hesitation. Like many parents, she believed that helping her child was simply part of love. Paying for the wedding, supporting Ryan through different stages of life, stepping in whenever something became difficult. These actions likely felt natural to her. But the problem begins when generosity is no longer seen as a gift. When people start expecting it rather than appreciating it, the relationship quietly shifts from gratitude to entitlement. That shift often happens slowly, almost invisibly. No one announces it. No one says out loud that they have begun taking someone's support for granted. Yet the behavior reveals it. Decisions get made without permission. Respect begins to fade. Boundaries disappear. The real lesson from Colleen's experience is not about revenge or punishment. It is about the power of recognizing when a boundary needs to exist. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are acts of clarity. They remind people that love and respect must exist together, and that support should never come at the cost of someone's dignity. In our own lives, this lesson can be applied in small but meaningful ways. Whether it is in family, friendships, or work, we all have moments where we must decide how much we are willing to give, and where our limits should be. Generosity is a beautiful quality, but it must be balanced with self-respect. When we communicate our boundaries calmly and clearly, we teach others how to treat us. Sometimes the most important act of kindness we can offer ourselves is simply refusing to participate in our own disrespect. Now I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective. Do you believe Colleen made the right decision when she stopped paying for the wedding, or should she have handled the situation differently? Please share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can see different perspectives. And if you enjoy thoughtful family stories that explore real human emotions and life lessons, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep empathetic story growing. so we can continue bringing you meaningful stories like this.